Now I call upon Dr. Angeline Shija, Assistant Professor of English, to handle this session. This is the ninth paper presentation session, which will be handled by Dr. Angeline Shija, Assistant Professor of English, Nesamani Memorial Christian College, Martandam.
Thank you, Dr. Samuel Nayagam. Thank you for the pleasant gesture you have shown. And let's move on to the ninth paper presentation session. Hope all the presenters are here, right? So shall we move to the session? Actually, the time is from 3:30 p.m. So the time has been advanced. Okay, it's fine. As we all know that this COVID has brought us together in an intellectual arena wherever we are in the sphere. I, Angeline, feel elated to be with eminent professors as paper presenters in the virtual platform. In this precious hour, we could listen to the mosaic of thoughts, views, and ideas of literary critics, that is, our paper presenters. Without much ado, let me leap into my task of summoning the first paper presenter, Dr. Yokesh Kumar Sharma, Associate Professor, Department of English, Swami Sharadanand College, Alipur, Delhi. Sir, it's your turn to play on the new interpretations on the words shroud or kafan. Is a
Uh,
Urdu word, it seems.
yes, you are right. I'm Yogesh Sharma from Swami Shraddhanand College, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Very good afternoon to all the listeners and viewers, and my very special thanks to the organizers and of this fourth world literature, and my special thanks to Cap Comoran Trust also, and Department of English, NMCC College, Kanyakumari. Now I begin the paper. During British rule, the colonizers have especially stereotyped views about the colonized people or we Indians, mainly about the upper caste Hindus, that they are lazy, corrupt, liars, ill mannered, uncivilized, violent, silly, messy people. This is a very negative and erroneous image they created about Indians. The native people for them were inferior human beings. They are just shapes and shadows of disease and starvation to them. And Dalit literature is full of such images, and Dalit writers have vociferously propagated this erroneous trend and image created by British people. Indian literature is full of such examples. This caste-based stereotyping has been a very popular theme for Indian writers also in the post-colonial era. And Indian Dalit, they look at the problem. Hello, please. They look at the problem of marginalized people and communities with the same mindset. They do not give much importance to economic conditions and other social problems, but they always see them as vested interest. Now, such studies have created a group of very powerful force and vote banks and other social pressure groups among Dalits, tribals, Muslims, women, physically challenged group, LGBT communities, and scholars and activists undertake research and development work on the same pattern. Nothing has been changed during the last 70 years also. This is a post-colonial theory and fashion to stereotype Hindus in a very negative and depressing way. They are described as racist and oppressors. Their positive traits are deliberately hidden or distorted by them. Post-colonial thinkers and intellectuals have demonized them as bully, uncivilized people. They have been branded responsible for all the problem of society and the country, mainly of Dalits, tribals, and oppressed people. But they could not mention their positive works. Hence, this article is an attempt to explore the wrong and intentional stereotyping of the Hindus especially the upper caste people as oppressor and Dalits oppressed by them. I talk about Munshi Premchand. He was a very famous Hindi and Urdu writer of the 20th century. He became more famous in the post-colonial Indian writers. And his Kafan basically was written in Hindi, but later on translated in English as Shroud. It's a very famous story written by him, and it describes the life of a Dalit family. Especially, you might be knowing a subcaste among Dalit. He mentioned the caste. The caste is mentioned by Munshi Premchand at Chamar, and Gisu and his son Madhav. Their father and son duo both are very lazy and obviously very poor people. Both do not want to do any work and just want to rest and relax all the time. Premchand begins his story, I quote, his depreciated note castigizing the father and son for their laziness. They are described as useless from an upper caste point of view because upper caste people are not able to free or cheap labor out of them. They were not taught by them. The value of lower caste people in society is measured by their utility to the upper caste people, unquote. And after the death of Budhia, the wife of Madhav, they have no money or resources for last rite and cremation. However, entire village, which consists of mainly upper caste people and Raj Thakurs, they donated money very liberally for the last rite of Budhia. And after collecting money, father and son went to the market. Instead of buying the shroud or kafan, they purchased wine, whiskey, pakoras, puris, and they danced in a private, you can say, wine shop or bar. And misogyny is perfectly depicted in the story of this shroud. The father-son duo, Gisu and Madhav, are inactive, sluggish, work-shrik, and lethargic people, I quote from the Journal of Aniket Journal of Social Studies. They are languid creatures who are not driven to work hard and take up menial jobs once in a while when there is a need. The patriarchs of the family remain ignorant about the plight of a woman when Budhia was undergoing pain due to her pregnancy. This is also another type of oppression in that family, which was absolutely ignored by the critics. They always criticize, or they take the point of only Madhav, males, only father and son, but they absolutely ignored the pain of Budhia, unquote. Shroud or Kafan is the first story that is treated by Dalit intellectuals as the first literary piece written on the condition of Dalits in India. However, it was a different issue that when this story was written by Munshi Premchand, there was no existence of this modern term Dalit, or these Dalit groups were nowhere at that time. This family owns their house. It was a big achievement to own it there. Although the house has nothing, they sold everything and purchased wine and other things. It was very poorly maintained and they have nothing in their possession. They were hardcore free buys lovers. I quote from the text, it was a family of Shama and notorious in the whole village. If Gisu worked for one day, then he rested for 3 days. Madhav was such a slacker that if he worked for an hour, then he would smoke his bidi or chilam for an hour. Thus, nobody hired them. If there was even a handful of grain in the house, they both swore off nothing to work. Unquote. And Gisu and Madhav, they were both have the same character. There was no difference between father and son. Shockingly, they were waiting for the death of wife of Madhav, Budhia, so they can sleep comfortably. They never cared about their responsibility for the pregnant woman as a husband or as a father-in-law. And this aspect has been neglected by the critics. After she came, I quote, they both grew even more lazy and indolent. Indeed, they even began to swagger a bit. If someone sent for them a work, they were splendid, indifferent, and demanded triple or four times the fixed rates. That women was dying today in childbirth, and these two were perhaps waiting for her to die so that they could sleep and eat easily, unquote. And the storyline has been interrupted by the critics as only talking about the suffering and repression of Dalits. But nobody talks about the suffering and repression of the wife Budhya, a woman, by the same Dalit people, Madhav and his father Ghisu. But this story is beyond this theme. The story of Ghisu and Madhav is not the story of the condition of Dalit, but it is also the condition of a woman, and which is there in every tribal life, backward life, minorities life, and all this aspect has been neglected by the critics. Intellectual and academicians, especially the Dalit intellectuals, gave a caste color to this story. Although in this story they should have taken the miserable condition of Budhya or the wife of Madhav, but they absolutely neglected this aspect also. It described the reason for the poverty and backwardness too, that they have their own problems also. They were addicted to wine, they were addicted to bidis and chillums, they were free wise lovers, they were not interested in any work. So they used to take loans and but never paid, and every time they asked money from those upper caste Hindus and they never returned. So these are other problems also for their poverty. The upper caste Hindus were very kind and helpful to these people. When the wife of Budhya died, entire village donated some money for the last rites of the Budhya, but unfortunately that money was used in wine and in other dishes also, but they did not purchase the shroud or the coffin. But again, the second time, the entire village donated money, and they never cared that their money will be returned by them. And all the women of upper caste women, they came to express their pain on the death of Budhya. I quote, the sensitive women of the village came and looked at the body. They shed tears on the helplessness and went away. So this was the harmony in the village. But this aspect was also ignored by the critics, that there were complete harmony in the village and they were living comfortably with the upper caste people. But the critics and intellectuals have stereotyped the same idea: discrimination, repression, etc., etc. The term stereotype refers to the very general and almost vague views, and this is a very common or almost a very fashionable thing to describe things in this manner. This term is also applied to the story by critics and academicians. They attributed the story only to Dalits, whereas most of the description is very aptly true to women also, poor also, economically backward also, and everywhere this can be applied to different type of people, not only a particular caste or one particular caste group people. On the one side, noted storyteller Munshi Premchand has exposed the reason for the socio-economic poverty of the Dalits, and on the other side he has shown the harmony and brotherhood also in the society. But this was again neglected, ignored this fact, and the very peaceful coexistence in the village of Dalits with the upper caste people. This fact has been never mentioned by the critics and intellectuals in their analysis. I quote, then Ghisu remembered a landowner Thakur's wedding procession in which he had taken part 20 years back. The repletion that had been vouched to him in that feast was a memorable event in his life, and even today he remembers it. He said, I will never forget that marriage and feast. Never since then have I had that kind of food in my life. The girl's family, which was the family of Thakurs, fed puris to everyone as much as they wanted, great and small, big and poor. Everyone ate puris, rasgullas with real ghee made of chutney, raita, vegetables, flavor stew, yogurt, ice cream, everything was there. How can I tell you that these people are cruel? What relished them was is the feast. There was no limit. Whatever thing you want, you just ask. Everything was there. And however much you want, eat. People ate so much that nobody could even drink the water. And there are servers were setting hot, round sweets, smelling pasties before you. You refuse, but they gave. And after the feast, they gave beautiful pan and branded cigarettes. So this is the harmony in the society. The realist mode of this was very realist mode of our society. The Premchand has hurt not only the people but the Dalits as well. The story, The Shroud, has truly and authentically narrated the extremely pitiable conditions and poverty of the Dalits. but he has discussed the reason, and he has given the solution also for this backwardness, for this poverty also. And they were unable to work enough, earn enough for themselves. It was a family which never worked. In this background, the wife of Madhav Budhia is crying due to labor pains. Ghisu and his son Madhav do nothing to help the women in this miserable condition. They just sat outside their thatched hut and roasting and eating potatoes beside the extinguished fire. They rebuffed to go inside the hut, though they could hear the screaming and thrashing of Budhia, but they did nothing. Ironically, in the recent past, some Dalit thinkers have denounced Premchand as casteist, largely because he depicts two Dalit in the story who oppresses women. These critics make the mistake of viewing only as Dalits, thus rendering Dalit women invisible. For them, women have no right, no equality. But in the same story, a women's oppression has been ignored by them. Thus, of course, repeats the underlying assumption in the male oppression of women, namely that men are human and women are less important group of humanity. The woman in the shroud is a hard-working victim, oppressed by her own family members, and ironically, they were Dalits, by the men of a family. And she too was also a Dalit. And I quote, they were sure that the villagers will give even every necessary thing after the child was born. And Ghisu gives his own example. He fathered 9 sons, and everything was given by the villagers. There was nothing in the house when his mother Madhavs delivered 9 sons, but he never felt a shortage of anything during that time. This was the real character of the village. This was the real harmony in the village. There was total harmony and total brotherhood in the village. And Dalits also enjoyed their harmony and friendship. I am thinking, if a child is born, what then? Dried ginger, brown sugar, oil, there is nothing at all in the house. Everything will come. If Bhagwan gives a child, those people who are now not given a paisa, they will run and will give everything to me, to you. I have had 9 sons. There was never anything in the house, but this is how they managed everything in the delivery. And that was unquote. But Ghisu and Madhav were very poor even to their women. Most likely both were waiting for her death. As anticipated, poor woman Budhia died the same night, and she was found dead by them the next morning. This story conveys more about the kind attitude of our caste of Dalit. Upper caste are always portrayed by Dalit thinkers in negative colors. Very bad images are created by them. To begin with, the entire village of the upper caste helped Ghisu and Madhav in the last rites of Budhia, and she was honorably cremated due to the support of the villagers. All support them financially and physically too. The landlord Saab was a very compassionate man, but to show compassion to Ghisu was to try to dye a black blanket. He felt like saying, but I quote, keep the corpse in your house and let it rot. Usually you do not come even when you are called. But this was not the occasion for anger or revenge, willingly or not. He pulled out 2 rupees and gave it to Ghisu. But he did not open his lips to say a single word. He did not even look. When the landlord gave 2 rupees, then entire village, all the merchants and moneylenders gave the nerves to refuse. Ghisu knew how to beat the drum of landlord's name. He gave 2 rupees, some gave 2 paisas, some gave 5 paisas, and in an hour he collected 5 rupees. Someone gave grain, someone gave wood, and in the afternoon, Ghisu and Madhav went to the market to get a shroud. Meanwhile, people began to cut the bamboos, poles, and so on. So all the villagers joined together to help Ghisu and Madhav in the cremation of his wife, Budhia. To start with, Ghisu and Madhav are illustrated from Dalit thinkers' point of view, and they have tried to describe upper caste in a bad shade. Thinkers have tried to brand those people in a negative manner. They have branded exploiters. This was very wrongly, clearly very mentioned by Munshi Premchand in this story, Kafan. Instead of blaming these lazy Lawrences, Ghisu and Madhav critics found out to blame the double system of a society. They did not blame these lazy Lawrences. but they blamed the others. Here, a society with Ghisu and Madhav are narrated as inhumans. Even death is good, profitable occasion for them. I quote, at the other hand, the spectrum of Ghisu and Madhav, the protagonist of Kafan, the debauched drinkers and complete rascals, these two Dalits barely get by in their own lives. So much so that the latter's wife passes away, they spend the money they beg for a shroud and they drink. Unquote. After the death of Budhia, the duo rushed to the Jamidar and villagers to again collect money, extract money. Here, Premchand is trying to transfer the blame to the kindness of society. So, Premchand is saying that the society should not be kind to such people. Free buys should not be given to anybody. These freeloaders system, they spoil them. So, Premchand gave this solution also that we should ask everybody to work, otherwise we should not support them, we should not give any money to them. And after drinking several cups in a row, both collapsed. Jesus said, what is the use of wrapping her in shroud? See, that what is the use of wrapping a dead woman in the shroud? After all, the shroud will be burned, but we are enjoying, she will go to heaven. So nothing would go with her. Everything will burn. Looking toward the sky as if persuading the angels of his innocence, Madhav said, it is the custom of the society. Why do these same people give thousands of rupees to the priest who can tell whether a reward does or does not reach them in another world? Why the people waste on these last rites? Why the people waste on cremations? Why the people waste on priests to perform the last rites? They prefer to enjoy drinking, smoking, etc. So Munshi Premchand give the solution also indirectly that such activities should not be promoted in society. They should be asked to work. Nothing should be given without any work, or free thing should not be given. Otherwise, the people will be lazy and slack and they won't work anything, and their future will be spoiled, their family will be spoiled. But what will you tell people? Won't people ask anything? So Ghisu laughed. We will say that money slipped away from our pocket. We searched and searched throughout the night, but we could not get the money. So instead of telling the truth, they are trying to hide. And more than half of the bottle had been finished by them. Ghisu ordered 2 kilos of puris, a meat, spiced liver and fried fish. And so they asked such things, and they asked for English wine. Madhav became restless and questioned Ghisu for not providing for a shroud. But Ghisu rebuked him that we should not mourn the women. Women was very kind-hearted because of her, even in her death, we are enjoying this thing. To conclude, it can be understood that reformist academicians and thinkers have associated or accused the upper caste with negative characteristics and images. It seems that they have a vested agenda. But here, all have failed to show the heroic fight and support of the upper caste people to the Dalits. So Munshi Premchand is very right. And in the very famous newspaper Hindu, Dalit thinkers see in it an attempt to mock the untouchables in Kafan, a charge that looks preposterous if one takes into account Premchand's writing in their totality. And if you, like Dharampir, let their imagination run riot and attack the story for those episodes or relationships that are not found in it, but which according to them logically flow from it, this is nothing but turning the methodology to literary criticism upside down. And with this, I end my paper, and thank you very much for bearing with me and listening with me. Over to the in charge of this session, Angela Shija ma'am.
We all applaud you for presenting the nuances on the fourth world literature, particularly on the post-colonial writing, the problems of the subordinates oppressed, the Dalits. From your words, I quote, suffering and repression. The normality of the village is disturbed. Ignored facts for the Dalits is being by the upper class people. Apart from all these hardships, harmony and brotherhood in the village is a highlight to look into as a lesson for the humanity. A heroic fight for for the Dalits from the side of the upper class people. It's a good insight, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
If anybody is having questions, you can shoot it. If not, we can move to the next session. Next presenter.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So next presenter is Dr. Rajkumari Ashalada Devi, Assistant Professor of English and Cultural Studies, Manipur University. Now she will throw light on mapping the disarrayed African consciousness in Chinua Achebe's Arrow of God. The platform is yours now, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, respected chairperson of this session and the fellow participants who have joined this session as paper presenters and the listeners of this session. So the title of my paper is Mapping the Disarrayed African Consciousness in Chinua Achebe's novel Arrow of God. Chinua Achebe's novel Arrow of God deals with the division brought into the harmonious society by the white man who has deeply penetrated and gained steadily greater strength to finally vanquish the traditional culture. Africa has already submitted to the political domination of British and is reconciled to the values of an alien culture. The devastating effect of the imperial power has become a reality, and the irreversible law of change also begins operating, crushing the individuals who opposes the historical process. The problematic of colonial discourse is that the colonizer creates the myth of the inferiority of the colonized. In their attempt to obliterate everything from the memory of the colonized about his past, the colonizer imposes the distorted version of the pre-colonial past of the colonized that the colonized feels ashamed of his past and everything related to his native culture and civilization, which he thinks inferior and lacks dignity. However, as pointed out by Bill Scruff and others, the colonizers, I quote, neglect the fact that for many people in post colonial societies, the pre colonial languages and cultures, although themselves subject to change and development, continue to provide the effective framework for their daily lives, unquote. So to counter the colonial discourse, African writers like Chinua Achebe and others, they take up the task of rehabilitating the lost dignity of their nation and attempt to bring about a social and cultural renaissance through their writings. The novel Arrow of God fictionalizes an actual incident documented in Simon Nolim's pamphlet, The History of Umuchu, where a priest named Ijugu, who is the high priest of Uchu, declined the offer of chieftaincy by the colonial administration, who was later imprisoned for his defiance in 1913. The priest, after his release from captivity, refused to eat the sacred yams, which he was supposed to consume as part of his ritual meal. In the novel, Achebe displays the predicament of the priest Ijugu in the character of Ijulu, the chief priest of Ulu, who also resists the colonial imposition of alien ideas and alien rule in an alien country. The novel revolves around the character of Ijilu, the ritual and religious leader of Umaro, and focuses on a crucial epoch of the 1920s when radical changes were taking place affecting the traditional way of life of the Igbos. Ijilu is the chief priest of Ulu, the newly created god of Umaro. Umaro is a confederation of 6 villages. By virtue of his being the chief priest of Ulu, Ijilu occupies a very important place in the tribal society of Umaro as religious head and also the timekeeper. As instructed by the will of Ulu through the oracles, Ijilu names the days of the feast, festivals and plantation and harvest guided by the movements of the moon. He calls the biggest festival the New Yam Festival, which ushers in the harvest season. So Ulu's protection and security is not only religious, political, military, and ethical, but also economical. It also ensures such things as keeping the communal status. And the life of the community depends upon Ijulu's timekeeping. He is considered as a half man and half spirit, symbolizing spiritual authority over the people of his jurisdiction and an intermediary between the world of humans and the world of spirits. From the very beginning of the novel, Ijulu's human and spiritual parts are not harmoniously going. The clan's dissatisfaction of Ijulu arises when he gives evidence to the Operi land dispute, and in turn he also develops in him a sense of resentment towards the clan. In reality, the disputed land belongs to Umaro, but Operi's claim over it becomes possible because they become more powerful than Umaro, as Operi has already welcomed the missionaries and the government, while Umaro, on the other hand, has remained backward. The white man's administrative presence thus undermines the traditional confidence and shakes the sense of common purpose and solidarity which in the past constituted the spirit of traditionalism. Here, the colonizer is represented as the force of order, whereas the colonized culture is seen as chaotic and inferior, needing pacification. Then another character of another facet of Ijulu characters is revealed at the time of this deputation to Perry to settle the dispute. Ijulu refused to support his clan, and he takes side with the white men. And during this land crisis, Umaro is divided into two. The two Izulu. Akukalia has committed an abomination, and so he refuses to wage the war against Operi. And there was another group headed by Nwaka, who is a very rich and influential person in Umaro, and he denounces Ijulu's opinion, saying that the clans must not allow itself to be led by Ijulu. To them, the taboo is Ijulu's mother, a daughter of the opposing town in the land dispute, and Noka openly challenges the power of the chief priest. Then Ijulu later defies the clan by sending his son Odushe to learn the ways of the white men, and that very action goes again contrary to his status as chief priest of Ulu. It is at the insistence of Winterbottom, the white man, the white colonizer, whom Ijulu takes as a friend, that he decides to send his son to be his eye and heir there. Ijulu only realizes that the new force could be used to the benefit of the community towards whom his responsibility is so strong. He is able to see the strength of the new force and attempts to come to terms with it in his own way. With Oduse as a lookout and eye in the enemy camp and himself in full control of the situation in the traditionalist camp, Ijulu feels more secure, but he fails to realize that colonial education is only an ally in maintaining control of the natives under the guise of a liberal education. Ijulu is sending his son Oduse to the mission school as a sacrilege, and his testimony against the clan during the Operi land dispute embraces the clan as a whole. His actions are conceived as part of his strategy for reinforcing his personal power by ingratiating himself with the British administration, and also an attempt to reach a personal accommodation with the force threatening the old social order. Then, to sharpen the conflict within the clan, Oduse, instead of learning the white man's wisdom and secrets, boxes in the royal python, the totemic animal sacred to Idimili. So, in the colonial situation, the devastation of a culture is indispensable. Colonialism exposes traditional myths and symbols, depriving them of their substance so that their new value system and thought could replace the new one. The primary function of Christianity being the degradation and devaluation of Umaro's traditional symbols and customs, Idimili's sacred symbol, the royal python, is represented by the Christians as a mere snake associated with the fall of men. Christians can only succeed in controlling the minds and hearts of the people of Umaro by degrading national symbols and denying them their mythical significance. By the same reason, Christian myths are narrated to provide new models of behavior and conduct, of heroic feats to be emulated, and of virtues to be fulfilled. So, at the height of this mountain crisis, Winterbottom summons Ijulu to Operi Hill Station. Winterbottom, having received a directive to introduce indirect rule in his area of authority, decides to make Ijulu a warrant chief for the Umaro district, the only person who has impressed him by testifying against his people's interest in the Operi land dispute. Now the clan conflict, already gaining its momentum, reaches a climax with the intervention of colonial administration. The penetration of the white man with a system of indirect rule over the continent shakes the very foundation of the indigenous society. The unity, solidarity, and communal harmony which lie at the heart of things begin to crumble. The white man's arrow hit at the center of things, and eventually things have fallen apart, the center losing the whole. The theme of things fall apart once more enacted in this novel. The native culture is totally destroyed, and with its fall, a new way of life develops with new policies, a new form of government to rule and subdue the natives, and a new economy based on caste economy. What is evident in the book is the change inevitable in the historical context in which the inferior culture is crushed and destroyed by the more powerful and domineering culture with a false notion of a civilizing mission. The crucial point about the imposition of indirect rule, that is, the superimposition of the superior culture, denigrating the native culture, is that those people who come to rule are not aware of the existing crisis of the society and do not understand the psyche of the native Africans. The messengers who have come to deliver Winterbottom's message to Ijulu are the colonialist intermediaries and functionaries who have assimilated the alien culture and are alienated from their roots, and as such, they, in their attempt to act and behave like the colonizer, mishandle the situation. Ijulu refuses to leave his home immediately for Okperi as ordered by Winterbottom. Instead, he summons an assembly of the Council of Elders to inform about the message. He expects the councils to advise and support him in his decision not to comply with the white man's summons. Thus, at one point, he supports the English education, and at another, he challenges the British authority. As pointed out by John Povey within Courts, he is flexible enough to send his son to join the white man that he may learn, but firm enough to resist the changes the English attempt to bring. Ijulu faces humiliation from the clan that insults him for his alliance with the white man. Now he abandons the effort to mobilize support with his clan and sets out to Okperi to face his fate single-handed, nursing grievances against Umaro. In this case, the community is not behind Ijulu. They are confused by fear of the new power in the land and so insist that Ijulu go to Okperi at the invitation of his white friend. Ijulu's refusal to accept Winterbottom's proposal symbolizes Winterbottom's failure to understand Ijulu and the connections and traditions he represents. The conflicting values of the two cultures thus lead the characters miscomprehend the motives of one another. This happens because of the colonial relationship based on the power nexus in which the dialogue between the colonizer and the colonized never takes place. During the absence of Winterbottom's absence, Tony Clark, who is also a colonial administrator in that area, he maltreats the situation, and Ijulu is detained in the guard room. He is imprisoned for his obstination and refusal to cooperate with the administration. At this moment, Ijulu realizes that the white man is not a friend but a communal enemy threatening the core of his society. In Umaro, the news of Ijulu's detention and his rejection of the white man's offer to be a warrant spreads like wildfire. Few people believe the story of his rejection, and how could he refuse the very thing he had been planning and scheming for these years? These are the questions being asked by his clansmen. Neither the clansmen nor a white man seem to understand Ijulu. He becomes a loner and is trapped in the historic situation and psychic tension, which is part of his tragic personality. After 32 days, Ijulu is released. His anger now turns on his people who remain complacent over his predicament. He sees the villagers as his first enemy, and his opportunity to avenge him for their lack of support comes after his release. His resentment against his people is his serious inertia. He lets his personal feelings interfere with his usual lucidity. As a chief priest, one of Ijulu's duties is to call the New Yam festival, but the agricultural calendar is upset because of his detention, as he could not eat the ritual yams while in detention. So he refuses to call the feast of the New Yam as he is not ready to eat the remaining 2 yams. He is to announce the beginning of each month and eat one of the ceremonial yams, which signifies the month is passing. The elders suggest spiritual remedies and insist that Ijulu must find a way out to save the harvest, and the abominations that follow will rest on their heads. However, Izilu, who deals with secular logic in order to reaffirm Ulu's power, strongly denounces their argument in the following terms. I quote, "Those yams are not food and a man does not eat them because he is hungry. You are asking me to eat that. I am the chief priest of Ulu, and what I have told you is his will, not mine. It could not be my wish to ruin all these people. It could not be my wish to make the smallest man in Umaro suffer, but this is not my doing. The gods sometimes use a whip." Unquote. To find a solution to the mounting crisis, Ijulu consults the deity, but to the dismay of the clan, he informs the clan that there is no response from the deity and that the 6 villages would be locked in the old year for 2 months longer. Consequently, Ijulu's action results into domestic squabble. In the crisis, Ulu, being the communal deity of Umaro, takes side with the clan and crushes the priest and yields power to the new god to save the clan. Here, the god is made to serve the ends of the ancestors, the clan, and the people. The delay in harvesting the yams hurts the people and threatens famine. Until Ijulu has performed his rites, the harvest cannot take place. Later on, the clan defects to Christianity, and the clan's defection to the new faith is the result of the failure of the old dispensation to provide security and the availability of an alternative source of security. Things started falling once again, and the fragility of the cultural defenses becomes apparent in the new situation. The church improves on the traditional Igbo tribute, which is 1 yam per family. The missionaries ask the people to bring not only yams, any crop whatsoever, or livestock or money, anything. Finally, at the end of the novel, Ijulu goes mad, contemplating the intolerable situation to the extent that it allowed Ijulu in his last days to live in the haughty splendor of a demented high priest and spared him knowledge of the final outcome. So Ijulu at the end becomes a helpless victim of his own deeds. He can't stand the loss of the glories of the older days and is shocked at Umaro's triumph. Umaro's triumph is symbolically the triumph of colonial power. Ijulu is crushed in the historic process of inescapable change at the time of rapid social change, when historical developments might actually challenge the sanctity and hegemony of his deity. Ijulu goes out of his way to dissociate Ulu from the social structures of Umaro. So, arrow of God. So, while dealing with a difficult and transitional social, cultural, and political scenario of Africa, since the African reality, which is characterized by contradictions and duality. This is at the root of post-colonial cultural changes as documented in this novel. Achibi's hero is a typical African character who was successful in the pre-colonial African world order. The novelist's handling of the complex historical situation as centering around this character, who is in his own right a classical tragic hero, reminds of the great great Greek heroes. It's a proof that the book is a masterpiece. We see 2 kinds of defeat. One, the defeat of the hero due to his anger, internal conflict, and error of judgment. And then the culture's defeat at the hands of the ruthless invaders from the West, as Achibi calls in his preface to the African trilogy. We can see that despite his willingness to embrace some of the Western values, Ezilu has to maintain his human dignity, for he is not ready to compromise everything to get the blessing of the white man. He alienates from the white man first, and his action that follows culminates in his own fall, now deserted by all his clanspeople. At first, he accepts to a considerable extent the changes brought about with the coming of colonialism and Christianity and the dismay of and consternation of his clansmen. But when he is prompted by some innate feeling that the white has to stop somewhere, he stands alone, who now go together against the traditional values. In actuality, it is Ijulu who brings a native culture almost to the verge of collapse, for which he pays, like the arrow of his own god Ulu shot from the bow, the people symbolically. With the final destiny, a victim of madness, the culture succumbs to the wind of change and it gets confirmed. And what happens at the novel is the image of a totally disarrayed African society depicted in the novel. The center cannot hold together anymore, and the colonial power has already established and has become a reality. So with this, I end my paper. Thank you, ma'am. Over to
Please. Hats off, ma'am, for the canvas of ideas you have shared on division brought out by the imperial and colonial society in Africa. You also have documented how colonization has controlled the natives in the name of religion. Again, the crumbling down of indigeneity among the natives is vibrantly recorded here. Also, this Achabe uses his characters to be the mouthpiece to show how colonizers tried to disarray African consciousness, the glories of olden days among the natives. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
If there is any questions, you can air it now. Hope to move on to the next presenter. Is a turn of Ms. Rashmi Pulitzala, lecturer in English, St. Anne's College for Women, Medipatnam, Hyderabad, to create an impression on literature and films on modes of expression. Kindly take it over, ma'am. Excuse me, ma'am. Please.
Hello, everyone.
Yes.
Today I'm going to talk on literature and films as modes of expressions. Everybody knows that there are so many movies, films that have been which are inspired by literature, books. So where there are conventional modes of expressions such as radio, letters, telegrams, which have been completely taken over by various platforms such as smartphones, social media, many social media like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. But it becomes inevitable to revive and restore the conventional mode of literature, though there is a gradual awareness being spread widely. Literature, I feel, is in any form, anywhere, everywhere, and it's as vast as an ocean, and the human relations and the events that occurred in the past, that is history, be it World War I or II, the French Revolution, any revolution, the Russian revolutions, etc., which formed the major themes of writings of literature since time immemorial, and which in turn became subjects for feature films, the regular feature films, almost everywhere around the world. Popular fiction, such as short stories or even novels and dramas, all of which are being presented today, have been in some form or the other been adapted from the contemporary literary works. Take, for instance, Shakespeare's classics like Othello, Hamlet, Comedy of Errors, and so many other books, literary works. And also, not books, but great speeches which are made into literature, like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg speech. All these are literature. Even as we are literature enthusiasts, we see literature everywhere, anywhere. Like even adapted folk tales, epics, or ballads. Indian literature, for instance, very enormous in itself, like the great epics of Ramayana, Mahabharata, which are very complex from the comprehension point of view, which are now easily accessible in animated form or any form of short stories and many more, which children read and enjoy. The world is transforming drastically, and with times we need to keep up the pace. And we have to pass on our great heritage, culture, history to the new generations, which are really treasures. And this can happen only through the various new technologies available, like the social media. Otherwise, there is scope that they might get extinct. And we need to utilize these to the optimum level. And literature plays its role very well since time immemorial and is considered as an influential form of expression that is of universal interest. And It may be rightly said that the world's greatest works of literature have changed minds, which have changed minds, were root cause of Renaissance, which helped to alter the entire course of history. It also helps us to discover the past, present, and it acts as a bridge, a connect to the past and the present, and also the possible future. The most distinguished literary great writers like Chinua Achebe, Margaret Atwood, and many, many more capture all of these facets. So, in brief, by delving into the minds of other characters and worlds, and in stepping outside of ourselves, literature allows us to understand facts, change minds, stir empathy, and express our identities and values in various eternal ways. Literature also can offer insight into what a culture finds to be right or habitual, the day-to-day events or anything that is we are habituated to. And there are practically countless different forms of literature that illustrate cultural values, race, race, gender, origin, or even location, and heritage, to name a few. All these play a role in how an author expresses cultural values. Literature also presents today's generation, which still exists. It paves a way to the present generation to express itself in the form of art, various forms of arts, which is also a great source of knowledge and an instrument of entertainment. Books also are being read seriously by readers who crave for information, and recreationally by those who are passionate in exploring their imagination. Literature kindles new ideas. The best example for today's generation is our Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling. Like, from nowhere, it just captured the young minds and mesmerized the young minds like anything. All the seven series, like the young generation, they were totally engrossed into the Harry Potter series. It really created waves in English literature. It also gives voice to the people who want to express their opinions about certain things in life, be it politics, health, religion, and the like. Literature is the heart of songs, rhythmic and harmonious pieces that give message and inspiration to people. Talking about films, they are visual representations of literature, and they give life and action to the words written on a page. As simple as that. Whereas magazines, newspapers, television, radio, and even the internet contain literature. It is found everywhere, anywhere, in various forms, and the power affects us all. The power of literature affects us all. Whereas the films also are a great inspiration. And here we have cultural identity crisis as expressed by Jhumpa Lahiri in her novel Namesake, which became a very popular one. She delves into the lives of a Bengali family and how they are disturbed, and they are not able to connect to the first generation is not able to connect to the new atmosphere when they shift to America. So the Namesake, which also has been made into a mainstream Bollywood feature film, which from my point of view is a really influential one. Jhumpa Lahiri also, her actual name is Nilanjana Sudeshna. She authored quite many stories like Interpreter of Maladies and other novels and essays in English, and more recently in Italian. The Namesake, which was published in 2003, was her first novel, and in which she essays her own experiences, as her pet name is actually Jhumpa Lahiri, which she decided to retain even though her name is Nilanjana Sudeshna. Lahari revealed that Jhumpa is her pet name rather than her good name. And growing up in America, however, she has chosen it as her official public name. And this gesture annoyed some members of her family, who must find the public use of a private family name, who found it very inappropriate. And asserting the name Jhumpa is at once a misnaming and a refusal to be misnamed. And it is a powerful hybridizing speech act addressed to both her familial ethnic community and to her American readership. The novel Namesake also focuses on the contrasting experiences of the two generations of expatriates who immigrate to the US to experience life of the American dream which they long to live. It's a story of two generations of Indian family from Bengal and their struggle to acculturate themselves or acclimatize themselves in the West. The Bengali couple, they are Ashok and Ashima Ganguly. They arrive at Massachusetts from Calcutta in the late 60s. Though settled in America, they are not inclined towards Americanization. However, they attempt to acclimatize to the new surroundings and culture, whereas their American born children, Gogol and Sonia, are very much inclined towards the new adopted culture, obviously, as they are second generation immigrants. The story is about the emotional and cultural dislocation experienced by them. The dilemma differs generation wise. Adeshpal, in theorizing and critiquing Indian diaspora, has said the first generation has strong attachment with the country or origin. Obviously, the first generation, it takes a lot of time for them to get habituated and acclimatized to the new country or new place where they have been immigrated or migrated. But from the second generation, it becomes very easy. They adapt themselves very easily. That's what Jhumpa Lahiri tries to portray. Then from the second generation onwards, the ties with the homeland gradually get replaced by those with the adopted country. The food, the clothes, language, religion, music, dance, myths, legends, customs of individual community, etc., become the markers of identity. And in this novel, Lahiri has explored the state of mind of the first generation immigrants, Ashima and Ashok, and the second generation immigrants, her son and daughter, Gogol and Sonia. Ashima, who represents first generation immigrants, she finds it very difficult to adapt to the culture and the culture of the host country. Her sense of being at home is connected with India, her first homeland. Ashima's immigrant experience, identity problems, the gap between two generations are the issues dealt by Lahiri in the novel. To quote, while traveling for the first time to the US, she is pregnant, and she, to quote, but nothing feels normal to Ashima. For the past 18 months, ever since she arrived in Cambridge, nothing has felt normal at all. It's not so much the pain, which she knows somehow she will survive. It's the consequence, motherhood in a foreign land. For it was one thing to be pregnant. Throughout the experience, in spite of her growing discomfort, she'd been astonished and her body's ability to make life, exactly as her mother and grandmother and all her great grandmothers had done. This was happening so far from home, unmonitored and unobserved by those she loved. Because she was all alone, nobody was around her. Had made it more miraculous still, but she is terrified to raise a child in a country where she is related to no one, where she knows so little, where life seems so tentative and spare. In addition to the portrayal of the experiences of the two generations of expatriates, the novel also deals with the clashes between the two different worlds that the Ganguly family simultaneously inhabits. The characters are caught between two cultures, culture of the homeland and of the host country. They are in a dilemma as to whether they should remain in a ghetto of old values or break the barriers and get assimilated with the new. The Bengali couple, Ashima and Ashok, leave Calcutta, India, and settle in Central Square in Cambridge. As the Bengali, Ashima struggles through language and cultural barriers as well as her own fears as she delivers her first child. And as Bengali culture calls for a child to have a pet name and also a good name to be used in public, Ashok suggests the name of Gogol in honor of the famous Russian author Nikolai Gogol to be the baby's pet name, and they use this name on the birth certificate. As a young man, Ashok survived a train derailment. He survives an accident with many fatalities. He had been reading a short story collection by Nikolai Gogol just before the accident. He was so engrossed and he met with an accident. And lying in the rubble of the accident, he clutched a single page of the story, The Overcoat by the same author, in his hand. Gogol grows up perplexed by his pet name. As the child grows old, he is confused. He's not able to digest the fact that his name is Gogol and he's called by everybody by the same name. And entering kindergarten, and the Gangulis inform that the son he will be known as Nikhil at school. Then the 5-year-old objects and school administrators intervene on his behalf, sending home with a note pinned to his shirt stating he would be called Gogol at school, as was his preference. He himself preferred in the beginning initially, but by the time he turns 14, he starts to hate the name. And as Gogol progresses through high school, he resents his name more and more for its oddness and the strange genius for whom he was named. When he informs about this to his parents that he wishes to change his name, obviously his father objects to the idea but has to agree finally. And finally, legally, he changes his name to Nikhil Ganguly. This change in name and Gogol's going to Yale rather than following his father's footsteps to MIT sets up the barriers between Gogol and his family. The distance, both geographically and also emotionally, between Gogol and his parents continues to increase, and he wants to be an American, not Bengali. He goes home less frequently. He even dates American girls, and after graduating from Columbia University, he obtains his own small apartment in New York City, where he lands a job in an established architectural office. And he is rather stiff personality-wise, perpetually angry, or else always on lookout for someone to make a stereotypical comment about his background. Then, one day at a party, he meets Maxine, and Ashima, he takes Maxine to Ashima and introduces her, where Ashima dismisses Maxine, something that Gogol will eventually get over. Then, eventually, after this short stint, Ashok suddenly dies of heart attack while teaching in Ohio. Gogol has to travel all the way to Ohio to gather his father's belongings and his father's ashes. And in attempting to sort out his emotions, Gogol gradually withdraws from Maxine, eventually breaking up with her. And he begins to spend more time with his mother and sister Sonia. Ashima suggests that Gogol contact Moshimi, the daughter of one of her friends, whom Gogol knew when they were children, and whose intended groom. Graham broke up with her shortly before their wedding. But Gogol, as is his nature, is very reluctant to meet Moshmi because she's a Bengali, but does so anyway to please his mother. Moshmi and Gogol are attracted to one another and eventually are married. However, by the end of their first year of marriage, Moshmi becomes restless. She feels tied down by marriage and begins to regret it. Eventually, Moshmi has an affair with an old acquaintance, and the revelation of which leads to the end of their marriage. Then Sonia, his sister, is preparing to marry her fiance, an American by name Ben. But now Gogol is all alone once again. Nonetheless, comforted by the fact that Ashok, his father, prior to his death, finally told his son as to why he had chosen that name for him. Gogol comes to accept his name and picks up a collection of the Russian author's stories, that is the Overcoat by Nikolai Gogol, that his father had given him as a birthday present many years ago. Thank you. This is my paper. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. Thank you.
Ma'am, it's good to hear you that you have articulated the crux of reviving conventional modes of literature. Your consideration to restore the classics of immemorial times through social media is par excellence. Obviously, literature as a heart of songs is matched with films which is visualized. We excelled in keeping pace with literature and films by quoting various literary texts and movies, particularly based on that namesake. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
If anybody is having questions, you can show it now. If not, let me move to the next presenter. The fourth paper presenter of the session is Ms. S. Nivedita, research scholar of Department of English, Tiruvallur University, Serakkadu, Velu. She accompanies with Dr. K. Ravichandran, Associate Professor, Department of English, Tiruvallur University, Serakkadu, Velu. Here comes Nivedita to excite us on the different shades of feminism in Manchu Kabu's custody. The platform is yours, Ms. Nivedita.
Good evening, one and all present here. My topic is Different Shades of Feminism in Custody by Manju Kapoor. The novel reveals in detail the lives of two women, Sahun and Ishita, where one fight to move away from her husband and the other join with her husband. Sahun is the wife of Raman and they blessed with two beautiful children. They are Arjun and Rohi. But life was not the same after her meeting with her husband's boss, Ashok Khanna. Both Sahun and Ashok get attracted toward each other, and day by day their love gets stronger. And Sahun decided to divorce case, filling a divorce case against Raman, her husband. Ashok, on the other hand, is ready to take up the role of father for the two biological children of Sahun and Raman. However, as per the court order, the boy Arjun is given under the custody of his mother, while the girl baby Rogi is given in the care of Raman. The next character is Ishita, the wife of Surya, is a woman of qualities. She serves as a loving wife and a devoted daughter-in-law, earning a goodwill for the family members. But all changed as the month passed with any news of pregnancy. The blame is attributed to the female, and the female infertility is recognized as a ground for divorce. Fate brings Ishita and Raman together. The lonely man and the destitute woman joins to make a new family. Ishita shows true love and care towards Rugi, her only child now and forever. On the other hand, Shahun and Ishita and form a new family where Ashok serves a perfect guide and friendship to Arjun. Finally, the separated couples get into a much happier family life, leaving behind their former unhappy one. The role of women has undergone a significant alternation in the post-colonial era, as they now have much more control on their bodies and freedom in the terms of decision making. Manju Kapoor strongly believes in this change in women, and through her writing has made a strong impact by depicting the changing phase of Indian womanhood, where the sufferings but comfortable women even actually breaking through traditional boundaries. And this her novel Custody is extremely provides an insight in her wide and deep perspective of women's psyche. In this novel, she has raised the issues of globalization and liberations and drastically changing mood of society, along with the desire of liberty in women and infertility in women and the hollowness of modern marriage. And the protagonists are also the victims of their materialistic approach and the effect of urbanization. The two characters, Sahun and Ishita, Ishita is the character who serves as contrast to Sahun, and she needs family, but she rejected by her husband and her husband's family because her infertility. On the other hand, Sahun divorced her husband for began her new life with Ashok. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Well then, thank you, Nivedita, for sharing insight on feminism from Custody. And also you have pointed out something regarding the materialization and urbanization, because of that, how women struggle.
Yes,
Thank you for sharing this. So we are moving to the final presenter of the session. Is Mr. Satish N., research scholar of Nesamani Memorial Christian College, Martandam, in collaboration with Dr. M. Prabha Punyavadi, Head Department of English and Research Center, NMCC Martandam. He is ready to come up with the emerging ideas on the internalized white ideal and the traumatic consequences in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Kindly proceed, sir. Excuse me, sir. Not audible. Satish, sir.
Sorry for the. Am I audible now, ma'am?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Audible.
I would like to express my appreciation to the organizers of the English faculty of Nesamani Memorial Christian College. And before I begin my paper presentation, I would like to thank my supervisor, Dr. M. Prabha Punyavadi, for her continuous support. The topic for my presentation is internalized white ideal and the traumatic consequences in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Morrison presents three sets of families among the blacks: Claudias, Pecolas, and Geraldines, or Maureen Fields. The first one is comparatively better than Pecolas, but still had issues like accusing, threatening, whipping, presence of the mother. And also, Claudia and her sister has the threat of a guest who is staying with them called Mr. Henry. Peccola, compared to Claudia, Peccola had a miserable family. She herself was miserable because she considered herself ugly. The third set is Maureen or Geraldines. They had better comforts in terms of their houses and luxuries available at home. Besides, they considered themselves superior to the niggers because of their lighter skin. These three sets of families, they considered or internalized white ideal, and they reacted in particular ways. My paper specifically looks at three characters, how they have been influenced by the mistaken identity regarding the white ideal. These characters are also representative characters through whom the humanities or our acceptance of the wrong ideal, wrong supremacy, is shared by Morrison for our reflection. The nine-year-old narrator, Claudia, tells that adults do not understand, they do not pass information, and do not share clearly the reasons. Claudia shares her views about her parents, about the elders in her society, and especially about her mother. She says her mother is very verbally abusive and threatening, and she is very much frightened about the whipping given by her mother. About Peccola's family, which is revealed, she shares the general desire of the niggers to own decent properties or houses. The blacks, when they would own a house, they would want to decorate it too much because the psychical desire for home makes them fill the house with lots of decorations, lots of objects, as much as possible. Claudia, unlike Peccola, Claudia she has a hatred for whiteness or white supremacy or white ideal or white skin or whatever is white. Claudia hated white dogs, and she would have the impulse only to dismember it into pieces. She would break the doll into pieces, the white dolls. What she was doing to the helpless doll, she would also want to do with the girls, white girls. She has developed this hatred, which is actually her personal reaction to the whole society, what society was doing to her and girls like her. The dismembering of the white doll, breaking the white doll into pieces. The reason behind that is she wants to discover what makes these beautiful or considered beautiful, blue-eyed, yellow-haired, pink-skinned dolls beautiful. What is the secret in that particular doll or in that idea? How white is beautiful? She wonders what makes these white girls desirous, likable, and attractive. Black boys were mocking Peccola for her blackness. The boys who were mocking her, making fun of her, were themselves blacks. And because of their disrespect for themselves, that is what caused them to mock at the blackness of her own society member, a racial member, Peccola, to mock. On seeing this, Claudia is infuriated. And she tries to raise. Actually, Pecola had sat down because of the so much abusive words told against her. Claudia wants to raise her up, raise Pecola up, the wounded, broken, fallen Pecola. She wants Pecola to stand straight and protest against those boys. But Pecola has already internalized the wound, the blackness. She has already equated blackness with ugliness. So she accepted the reality in humility and directed all the consequent pain of such incidences to her eyes. There is another character, the third one, called Maureen. Maureen calls herself cute and beautiful. Though she is a black girl, her skin color is little whiter. A light-skinned girl, Maureen. She mocks at Claudia, Claudia being a darker-skinned girl. This actually aggravates the already disturbed, frustrated, and angered psyche of Claudia. This traumatic experience of a reaction by a fellow black girl who is a little whiter with her skin color, this experience makes her vehemently deny the beauty proportion to only whites. What makes Maureen like girls to say that being black was ugly? How could she assume that her light black was pretty? And how could she claim this, that white is the ideal color? There's also another character named Geraldine. She's also a light-skinned woman. She considers herself superior to the dark-skinned niggers. She teaches her son to differentiate between the niggers and the colored people. Maureen and Geraldine, these two people with a lighter skin, they separated themselves forcefully and segregated the niggers, the darker-skinned people. Maureen was able to call Claudia ugly, and Geraldine calls Pecola dirt and a dirty fly. Here, dirt is being associated with blackness, and cleanliness is associated with whiteness. Claudia likes dirt on her body. This likeness for dirt is childishness, which she changes later when she grows up. Morrison also brings to our attention the fact that Geraldine's son, Junior, has an interest in dirt. He wants to play with the black boys, and he wants to roll in dirt with black boys. These contrasting views by different characters show that Morrison wants us to question the accepted and agreed upon notions of color and beauty. The animosity, hatred, and contempt for blacks by a young girl like Maureen is quite surprising. Super clean, rich, and with attractive dresses, the Geraldines, the Maureen Pills, they look down upon the black people. Morrison raises the question as how being black makes one ugly. And for Pecola, having blue eyes, she could turn her ugliness into prettiness. Pecola believed in her ugliness, and she was very much convinced that she was ugly. The conviction that she has about her poverty, blackness, and consequent ugliness was unique to herself. And to come out of this, to seeking deliverance from this, Pecola believes that by having blue eyes, her beauty will be restored. She will have better appearance. She could be beautiful, like the blue-eyed white dolls. Pecola goes to a shopkeeper and buys Mary Jane candies. Mary Jane candies, chocolates. And Mary Jane is a symbol of whiteness and with blue eyes. So the pretty eyes of Mary Jane on the candy wrapper would be hers. The pretty blue eyes of Mary Jane would be transferred to Pecola when she takes in or when she eats those candies. To eat the candy is somehow to eat the eyes. Eat Mary Jane. Love Mary Jane. Be Mary Jane and become Mary Jane. The desire for blue eyes and the unfulfillment of it takes her further into psychological misery. She internalizes the idea of equating beauty with white skin and blue eyes. The shopkeeper even wouldn't want to touch her fingers. He had to receive the coins for the chocolates, but he was reluctant to touch her hand, her fingers. Even she heard a very offensive language from Geraldine, but not a fault of hers. So to solve all these issues, to have better glances from people, even to solve the miseries in the family, Pecola believes that having blue eyes will bring all the desired changes. The character, Soaphead Church, he uses a trick to make Pecola believe that she has finally received her blue eyes. But Pecola's belief in her miracle is a mental delusion. She quickly falls into schizophrenia. She develops faulty perceptions, involves herself in inappropriate actions and feelings, withdraws from reality, and moves into fantasy and delusion, the sense of mental fragmentation. She is so traumatized that she wouldn't want to talk about her most sensitive and aching experiences. Being twice raped by her own father, Pecola travels from misconceptions about beauty to a mentally affected person. The consequences will have a traumatic effect on the Pecolas of the world. Pecola internalizes the white idea, Maureen uses the color superiority, and Claudia reacts and acts against it. These three different ways, the three characters, absorb the idea but react in their own way. Thus, equating beauty with color will only bring dreadful and traumatic consequences. Thank you.
Your enthusiastic presentation has given a clear-cut idea on white ideal beating blackness. The concept of superiority is associated mainly with the color, the racialism, and here Morrison never fails to exhibit the sensitivity, the urge in black women, and how they were traumatized when they were not fulfilled with the conditions they desire for. Thank you so for good insight on Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. And if there is any question to ask him, please, participants can ask now. So if not, this is the end of the session, and hope that the array of intellectual food provided in the session would definitely help us all to explore more in various genres. And thank you all for giving me this pleasant chance to be with you all. Thank you, Anand.
Thank you very much.